Hello everyone, today we talk about the Church of Rome during the 10th and 11th century and of the extraordinary figure of Gerbert of Aurillac. So this is an introductory video that I intend to, present for going a bit further on certain topics, especially this extremely important moment in Christian history before essentially the let's say between the Ottonian times and the Gregorian reforms that had this massive importance of the history of the world. And looking at the premises, looking at the origins, I personally like very much the moment of the origins that weren't even origins by themselves, because in turn they had other origins, but just for saying that the Roman Church was not always, this papal lordship of low medieval times, and that in origin things might have taken another turn, reason for which we will focus also on the importance of the Roman aristocracies. That is something a very overlooked topic as well, as the city of Rome was very important during the Middle Ages. Rome didn't end at all with the Roman Empire. It always maintained its own, not just spiritual power, but also a very important political one. I mean, even from these local aristocracies were very powerful. We'll talk about Sylvester II at the second Gerbert of Aurillac, because he is also an extraordinary character of high medieval Europe, one of the most important popes in Christian in Western Christian history, and and we will look at. I will surely make a biography about Gerbert of Aurillac sooner or later, because in Schwerpunkt I will definitely arrive to do such things at a certain point. Today I would like to talk broadly about him and his life, but especially inserting him in this discussion because of the intellectual impulse that it gave to the let's say the autonomization of the Church of Rome from essentially secular powers, and building this idea that the Church had somehow a moral authority that couldn't be influenced or couldn't be conditioned, say, better by the imperial control that instead during Ottonian times had been strengthened. The Ottonians were basically the imperial dynasty that reached the greatest control at a point over the we will see with the Privy Legion Matonis, for instance, on the election of the Roman popes, and that kind of that achieved to control the church more directly, but basically all the other emperors failed to do in medieval times. And so where do we start from? Giving a bigger context, looking at the 10th, 11th century Western Church, we naturally observe that its situation was extremely complex and full of problems in practice. So in many in several European areas, the church was definitely subjected to very heavy conditioning from the lay world. This happened because essentially bishops and abbots normally covered offices into the public administration. It was nothing really new, but they were being tied, as also not very new, to the to the aristocratic families. They had a huge, not just they were framed into the feudal hierarchy that had been set by the Carolingian times, and at this point had fragmented, but was progressively towards the 11th century strengthening a little more, getting more structural structured as a system and more stratified. But in this sense, they were always conditioned by public affairs. This high clergy especially was extremely involved into royal policy, imperial affairs. These were figures that essentially were dealing extremely intensively into the secular world, and this had naturally caused a lot of questioning what was the role of the church, of the clergy, how much they had to be involved into these affairs, and if this basically whether this was affecting or not their fitness as men of church. So this this system, and you can imagine naturally that bishops and abbots at this point were becoming sort of feudal lords, just like the others. They didn't have just a big political influence, but also a great military power at this point, and they were progressively structured in this way. Naturally, the church was also very heterogeneous within it. Just think about the differences, in fact, that existed between the bishops and the abbots. Indeed, the Gregorian reforms started from the monasteries, but also in here it's not just the monasteries, because also these could vary from the Cluniac model. It was essentially a strongly aristocratic one, from others that instead had more strictly hermetic experiences, that incidentally will be the ones who, from Tuscany especially, that were to influence the most the at least in the shorter amount of time, this idea of reform, of purification of the church, that however paradoxically had been present also in order eventually for these new ideas to spread by the same Ottonian justification of their interference on the churchly affairs. I made some videos about this, into medieval Christianity playlist. There is a video called, if I'm not wrong, 11th century Rome, the rise of the reformers, that deals in detail, especially with the figures that in the decades immediately before the Gregorian reform brought to, in fact, to the change. I mean, how there were actually many let's say several interfering factors that brought to this phenomenon to happen, really, and it wasn't just something that had to happen necessarily. There were many contingent factors that brought to the Gregorian reform itself. I've discussed this also. I can't find anything here now. I don't know why, because today I'm destroyed physically. I made also a video on the Ottonians and the Kingdom of Italy that deals a little bit with the topic of bishop counts, for instance. So I realized just now that I haven't been making lots of videos on the papacy at that time, which is bad actually, because it's an excruciatingly important moment. I mean, the Gregorian reform, especially, as this turning point in world history, really. Yeah, maybe I've done also the dawn of papal monarchy, that can be interesting under this point of view, and something about the before the Gregorian reforms, Cluny, Hermitage, and Pataria, that were also interesting in this sense. I've done a couple of things, so maybe if you're interested, you want to have a bit more of a background, these videos are useful to understand the points I will be making today. But naturally, you understand that there are so many other related topics, including the role of the church into the Carolingian, post-Carolingian times, about which I've been discussing quite extensively at this point. So many perspectives that help, because really this the Gregorian reforms originated from a world of that was extremely complicated as a system, physically speaking. It had lots of factors interfering one with the other and producing this result in a completely even unexpected way, given how the events turned in the time in which they did. However, according to relatively to the political praxis of the church, because this is where it started from, that the church had always been in the hands of the aristocrats. It always had been highly political at this point. The problem now is that an empire was forming, and a relation between the empire and the church was being formalized. And the problem was that what the relation was between the emperor and the papacy basically reflected on the rest of the society. So this entailed that since the church was present practically everywhere and the vassals of the emperor were present everywhere, these relations could essentially find further justifications on the base of what the upper echelons were working like. So according to canonical tradition, the election of bishops had to occur by the decision of the clergy and of the people of each diocese, for instance. So this canonic tradition was naturally an extremely precious excuse for the aristocracies to basically impose the choices in the election of the clergy at their own will, because the theory is that naturally since early Christian times there was a differentiation between the clergy and the community, the rest of the community of the faithful. Each diocese had to work substantially as a monad on its own. So this entailed that there were laymen that were influencing the local affairs as much as the clergy, and this was taken as an excuse, not even to impose this lay power over the election of bishops or abbots and so on, because after all, these people were already the ones who ruled that particular situation. I mean, if you were a feudal lord at this point, you would have, for instance, private foundations. You would found, I don't know, you could be this varied naturally on your wealth, but there were many private monasteries at this time, were incidentally enormously powerful, enormously influential all over the local community, that were those abbots and abbesses were drawn from the local, from the family that founded that institution. Same for bishops. Bishops came traditionally from the local aristocracy since late Roman times. So it was not even a matter of imposing this, but depending now, just for this clergyman to be involved into strictly lay, into strictly secular politics. But the problem now was a matter of hierarchies as well, because the same church was from one side trying to structure itself a bit more autonomously. The emperors wanted to be always more interferent in this system, so there were lots of attritions that were producing overall in the system these two parties that also in here are very difficult to draw, because basically everyone at this point from an ideological point of view was stressing the idea of the fitness of the and of the purification of the church as an excuse to exercise a control over the election of the clergy. So as we've seen, this happened from the popes to down to the bishops and also other and it was a very important struggle. And this was all the more important the more these dioceses or monasteries and so on were growing powerful, also from a strictly, not from a strictly ecclesiastical point of view, but also from also interfering and receiving interferences between, in fact, the lay and the ecclesiastical world. So this idea of having a direct influence on the church foundations was so great that the great feudal lords, when found in these institutions, called them in Latin ecclesiae proprie. That means their own churches, and the in German area that also was very aristocratic in this nature, these were called Eigenkirchen. So really our own churches, private churches, over which they wanted to have the complete interference, and naturally the complete control. And this is less. I know that many people interpret these things from an ideological point of view, but it's not really the point. These were things that happened normally. These were patrimonial strategies. I mean, the Lord had founded this monastery, this chapel, this sanctuary, or whatever it was, and he controlled it because it was considered. I paid it myself, I built it myself. I've placed, I don't know, my sons, my daughters in there as abbots or abbesses. Why shouldn't I keep too? And naturally, this was also complicated by the fact that churchly foundations usually had some privileges, certain immunities. So here it's really too complicated to get in detail into the whole system. We will do it maybe more closely. We'll look at that more closely on another occasion. But just to tell you how many interests there were around this. And naturally, the political importance of the episcopal and abbatial, we can say, functions gave naturally origin to practices like the so-called simony. The simony is essentially the selling of these ecclesiastical offices, and the term comes from Simon Magus, that was this Samaritan. It was an adept of Gnostic philosophy, for which he basically offered gold money to Saint Peter in exchange for the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So this is in the Acts of the Apostles 8:18. And the Nicolaism, that was instead the transmission of the these offices to close relatives. So this was instead took name from a Christian sect of the very first centuries of Christianity that was accused basically to come to terms with paganism as well, to share the benefits of power and so on. So Rome at this point had basically sunk into the ability of exercising an authority of on the rest of the church, and this is another great systemic phenomenon that we'll have to look also into in detail, but for now in its causes. But you understand naturally what the consequences could be, because basically every church, where's there so much secular interference, also because there was no head of the church proper. I mean, nominally, surely Rome had this enormous influence, this enormous charisma and spiritual prestige, but it was still incapable to politically control everything that was happening into the rest of the Christianity, and it practically was as if just a church on its own, with more prerogatives, with more power, with more connections, but still one of these many other centers that were pretty much autonomous, and in this sense had even the interest in however, they were left alone in dealing with the other, with the lay aristocracies. So the papal office at this point was essentially very far from being an elective office. It was basically, it had basically been the papal election had been a prerogative of the aristocratic families that owned the power in Rome. So Rome was at this point one of the greatest cities of Christianity. It was also pretty rich, given the standards of high medieval Europe. It was a big city in the sense that also infrastructurally speaking was a great center of great importance. It wasn't just about the ecclesiastical prestige. It was still a solid center in many ways, and the local aristocracies were traditionally extremely influential on the papal election. It had basically been used to get to see family members elected to the papacy, and being always in contrast the one with the other. For instance, the Crescenzi family was one of the most important Roman families. Indeed, they had naturally many relations also with the family of the Theophylact, that had been very important into the history, especially in the 10th century. There was also the family of the Counts of Tusculum, that were another family essentially ruling in this area. These were all families that also had landed property around Rome. The Roman countryside was pretty wealthy. The Counts of Tusculum were coming from the Albanian hills, and they had this moment of great splendor in the first half of the 11th century. They probably were also here a branch of the Theophylacts, and they also here the importance given to their centers was sometimes infrastructural, given what was left in Rome and around the city. They were entrenched into the ruins of the ancient Tusculum among these hills, so they transformed this place in a formidable fortress. And then other branches of their family controlled other cities around, other towns around Rome. So they were also pretty much involved into the Ottonian policy and so on. And they dominated over Rome, and while the Crescenzi had more influence on the papacy. And however, this will not get into much into detail than this. And there was in here a bit of a differentiation that would occur later with other families of the Orsini and the Colonna, for instance. I mean, the Counts of Tusculum usually sided with the empire, while the Crescenzi with the papacy. So that they having, but not because they were in fact the same Counts of Tusculum wanted to, to exercise the same power of the church. At that time, they would have, if they had achieved that, they would have been against the empire, and vice versa. So it was a matter of really who owned the control over the city as a whole, and at that time it was practically very difficult to have a single ruling family on such a big system like the one of Rome. So there were these continuous clashes and instability that affected heavily the whole European history at that point, because the relation between papacy and the empire was basically dictated by the balance of between the Roman families, and also the emperors had essentially to play on this and to have a. In fact, the Ottonians definitely came to extremely to have an enormous influence on the papacy, but this was still fluctuating in many ways, and it was very difficult for them to control Rome in the first place. Even Otto III, that came to live into Rome itself, always had enormous troubles keeping the local city ordered. And it's simply because the local aristocracies were so strong, and they perfectly realized that their city was so much related to this international prestige, and they wanted to essentially share this power, and keeping also in here the constant contacts also with the Byzantines, not just with the German emperors. So really playing the same policy that everybody who ruled over Rome at this point would do, because with the lack of a strong central authority, with this massive fragmentation of political power into Europe, this decentralized position of Rome, and between the two empires, and the wealth of the city and of the surrounding countryside, was definitely an extremely favorable precondition for building an autonomous power. So now maybe we don't go on, because in here eventually okay, we will not discuss this now, because this is a very complicated history, by the way, of all the today we're going of the various popes. We're going to discuss essentially only Sylvester II, not all that existed before. But you really have to think these families, there's Roman families fighting constantly, and every papal every pope was essentially tormented by these balances, and especially the 9th and 10th centuries had been pretty tough. So when the Ottonians came, even to establish this tutelage over the church, they had partially tried to pacify also these families, and actually one of the reasons why the House of Saxony came to Rome, that was not just, in fact, the usual tradition that had been set from Carolingian times, that the Ottonians went into, as for being crowned emperors and so on. But there was also a need for basically stem the influence of the Roman families over the pontifical soil. So, like saying, we take care of that, so the church will be free from these interferences. And this was the point, because it entailed a form of purification, if you want. So especially the Ottonians in Germany had been able to create a similar system for which essentially the German church was well framed under the control of the monarchy that was being formed by the Ottonians. It was a very strong alliance between the two powers. Also in here, it's very important for German history, because that's essentially the moment in which the great ecclesiastical princes of Germany emerged, and they basically stuck usually with the imperial authority and contributed to strengthen it, for which obviously the German monarchy has always been extremely tormented as well, so never had this very strong public power, and they were relying on the church for maintaining this system cohese. So the Ottonians had emanated the so-called Privy Legion Ottonis, that was this imperial legislation through which Otto I had basically decided to resolve this very old vexata question of the relations between the papacy and empire, that had always been pretty ambiguous since the beginning. In institutionally speaking, who had really what was the space of interference of one of the powers on the other. This was very complicated to determine, and so at the same time he was practically trying to legitimize its imperial control over the papacy. So basically the Privilegium Ottonis 962, so Otto's privilege, that would be or Privilegium Ottonianum is also known. This is not important, but it basically established that the papal election had to happen exclusively with the consent of the emperor and at the presence of its own representatives. So it was naturally something very I can say for this was following, as we were seeing before, with the canonical law according to which the election of bishops had to be carried out by the clergy and the people of the local dioceses. So this naturally, the papacy was a bit more complicated, but it was also, Rome had its kind of provincial dimension. Even now, it's very complicated to explain how the papacy was practically elected, all the various suburban dioceses that existed, and on. I know it's lots of things to tell one together, but we will do it at one point. We will need to do it at one point. Now we don't have much time, but the idea is that there was a participation of the local aristocracy in many ways. I mean, at the time of of Charlemagne's crowning, for instance, there is in all the sources this presence of this Roman people, and you don't have to imagine in Saint Peter, the Roman people as if the guys, the lower class, and these were naturally the most splendid Roman aristocrats that were there as representatives of the city that they owned through their clienteles and so on, to have been to make the representatives of the people. So as we've seen, practically with the Privilegium Autonis, actually the emperor was not to name the pope. This actually happened later with another, at the time of Henry III, with the Privilegium of Sutri. But basically, it was the local clergy and people that elected the bishop. But basically, this election had no value if the emperor didn't give his consent. So this can, obviously it's ambiguous, because from one side Otto I and his successors had a positive this privilegium had a positive impact, because it was meant to elect popes that had a further selection of some sort. Naturally, this also meant that there were popes who were elected from not from the Roman families anymore, for instance. So there would be external appointees that were essentially presented by, suggested by the emperor. So also a lot of foreign authorities, and not just in the papacy, but also in the rest of the local bishops of for instance, of the Italian clergy, that at this point was being essentially Germanized by the Ottonians in order to achieve control on the cities that at that point naturally were the cornerstone for the domination of the Italian peninsula, given that the Ottonians had no other power to basically subdue this enormous system of the Italian kingdom by themselves. They were recurring to, backing the local ecclesiastical aristocrats against the lay aristocrats to practically achieve this power. So from one side, indeed, the Ottonian influence presented a bit some benefit, because certain popes were objectively quite important authorities that were chosen on the basis of they were educated people who and we can't say that the general choices were not that bad objectively, because these were actually good figures, and they gave back to the papacy a greater moral prestige. However, it's still obvious that the church at this point was being directly influenced by a secular power that had basically no authority in strictly ecclesiastical terms, as the it was the divine that was meant to have this prerogatives of the church, and not any other earthly authority. So the things went even worse in further. Now we will not arrive to it temporarily today, but at a certain point, with the Privy Legion of Sutri in 1046, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III basically obtained from this council that was from the council was held in this city of Sutri to obtain the right of choosing directly who had to become pope. So even skipping the election practically, or at least suggesting someone before, so not having to wait that someone present. So this was naturally a candidate. So this was naturally theoretical, because every papal election actually worked in a different way, one from the other. It was something highly political, dependent on so many factors. The balances, in fact, with Roman aristocracy, was with the power of the empire in this international situation. So we can't simplify, but there is this evident extension of the imperial interference in this thing, and there were certain further cultural elements that naturally informed these views, these conceptions, because, for instance, the Privilegium Motonis in itself can be interpreted as a sort of logical consequence of the Germanic concept of the Mund, or Mundum in Latin, as it was Latinized. It is basically from the ancient German, this concept of protection that was extended usually. For instance, it was extended on the women. In Germanic world, originally speaking, every woman was not free. Was basically she was autonomous, but her what the Romans would have called potestas, and here it was the mundum, belonged always to a man. So basically, everything that a woman wanted to do, even legally speaking and so on, had to pass through the decision of the man. So the church now was seen as if, compared to the empire, as a sort of bride that had to be guided as by the local authorities. And the German church already knew pretty well this system, so it was actually nothing new in that context, but it was definitely something very difficult to make fully accepted into Italy at this point. And not because theoretically, because also in Italy there was the Mundum, for instance, but in daily life, but there were so many different political balances compared from Germany that had to be taken into account, and that's how eventually the whole thing failed in the end, because in fact the Roman aristocracies were essentially gaining at this time more power once again on the life of the church, and not just in Rome. This was happening all over the Western Christendom. This attempt during the Renovatio Imperii that the Ottonians made to frame even the rest of Europe into their because now it's difficult. The problem is that from Carolingian times, the idea of a central authority, of a central empire, was always there. So even when after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, and then after the reconstruction of the Ottonian Empire, wasn't objectively this great much from a sheer control of the territories over which it claimed sovereignty. There was still this dream, this idea of making the an empire unique. And it's a different perspective from the usual to think about, because eventually we know the story, especially looking at this of low medieval Europe, that is a bit I don't know why, but the Europe as we imagine it by standard during the Middle Ages, we think of this not just politically fragmented world, but a world that was politically fragmented on the base of known entities, like especially national monarchies and so on. And at this time, this was not given for granted. I mean, the idea of the unique empire and its essential prerogative and very remotely and theoretically theoretical ability of extending its power all over the continent was still there. It's difficult to reason in these terms, because eventually we know that these big chunks eventually emerged, like Germany, like France, like these other powers that were more or less autonomous, that we identify as such before then even thinking about the empire. Let's be honest about it. When most of the people, when they look at a political map of 13th century Europe, they don't see Europe through the eyes of a medieval person, not just from a sheer cartographical point of view, but they see it through the eyes of a 19th century nation state, as if those colors, those borders were effectively something concrete that corresponded to certain identities that were different from the other. This was not really like it. At this time, the average European would think that he was living into the Roman Empire. In the 10th century, in the 11th century, you were living into the Roman Empire. That was the average mentality of it. And there had to be an emperor. And everybody knew, and this is probably the most fascinating thing, that everybody knew that these emperors had a freaking low power. Come on. The Ottonians couldn't even extend their power all over Germany. You can imagine over Italy or over other areas of the empire. It was very difficult to accomplish such a thing. They had, however, a power that could definitely influence all over the places. They could put in motion. Now, this is very complex. I don't know why I'm digressing once again. I'm trying to make this video actually speedier because I feel so sleepy. I didn't sleep at all last night. So probably you have already heard me yawning before, but I care to make this point because the idea was still that the emperor could have, especially in Ottonian times, this direct control over the local churches. And already at this time, the aristocracy is observing that objectively this new empire was not this big. They began to claim also a bit more prerogatives on their own local churches, saying, okay, but we de facto ruling here. If you were Southern French or you lived, what was the Ottonian Empire? Of course, it had a huge influence, it had a huge impact. It could even be, theoretically, it had a military deterrence that could make you, these Saxon armies arriving even in there, but the European world was emerging now also, because it's paradoxical. At this time, the world was Europe was way more fragmented than before, but this is why a central authority like the size of the Ottonian one seemed in perspective bigger, because there was no other power like that, even if it wasn't that much. So in the 13th century, for instance, there were enormously more powerful entities, but there were still so many, and so, however, big enough to create a balance upon each other. At this point, theoretically, all these small lordships all over Europe could be influenced more directly by the local emperors and so on. So the point I was making is, we already said how essentially the hegemony exercised by the emperors on the clergy often worked in order to elevate the level of the pontiffs and of the bishops. But in this sense, I would like to start to talk about Sylvester II and looking at how he basically embodied, I mean, how the same need for an ecclesiastical purification, the same that was backed by the same Ottonians, influenced the same church to take a different turn from the one the Ottonians had hoped. Talking about Gerbert of Aurillac. So basically, at this point, the Emperor Otto III was to grant the favor to Gerbert, bishop first of Rheims and then of Ravenna, so some most important archbishoprics of Europe at this time, to elevate him to the pontifical charge with the name of Sylvester II. And at this point, Otto III was definitely in love with the concept of the Renovatio Imperii, so this idea that the Roman Empire could be practically re-established, and also Gerbert of Aurillac definitely had its own dream in this sense. And now we'll see it. Gerbert had fled France at this time because of political problems relatively to the election. Firstly, I think at this point because he had opposed to the marriage, to a royal marriage, because of canonical issues. This is how the very moment at which the Capetians start to rule over France after his ferocious struggles with the rest of the nobility. These and Otto III had, Gerbert of Aurillac had become mentor and counselor of Otto III as such, and Otto III was he was so in love with Rome. He basically, I think he spent more time in Rome and into Germany. He wanted to create the empire, to rule from Italy, to have this. He was, after all, son of a Byzantine princess as well, from the to the emperor of the West. So he lived into this very ideological dimension of the greatness of Rome, of the imperial power, and hoping to restore it, universally speaking. Then eventually he failed, also because he was frustrated by the same Roman aristocracy that absolutely didn't want, were starting now to push much to remain essentially autonomous and independent from this interference. And there are certain letters, like, to the Romans, like, why don't you want your emperor? God wanted it, and so on. So it's very, we will maybe go in detail another time, but it's really like all this hypocrisy, if you want, because this was the hypocrisy justifying through the let's say naturally to this universal authorities, the fitness of the same. Practically, the idea was, well, you were emperor, it's because God wanted you there. Point. And naturally, this is more complicated, but it was definitely very much used, and we as a concept to stress your own prayer. And it wasn't even so. Maybe just said it was hypocritical. Definitely was, but at the same time, it also had a sense in, especially in that world, as I feel that especially the concept of the Roman Imperium was pretty much alive in the ancient man. This was not still a fully Christianized world, to be honest. I mean, it's obvious that the hierarchies had, but you have to think really of the mentality that still existed into this German. Think about the Ottonians and the context where they came from, what it meant to bear, to have an empire, because you bore arms, and you somewhat deserved this by divine sanction, as long as you won, as long as you were victorious and glorious only, in this context. So the Gerbert of Aurillac was born in Aquitaine, in this in Alvernia, actually, in Auvergne, in this area that was so in fact at Aurillac. So in this area that was in southern France, so actually very distant from the Frankish world. I mean, these were areas that were relatively lightly touched by the Frankish world, and he was born around the mid of the 10th century. I don't think we know, probably around 940, something like that. So he came from a world that was a bit of halfway between, in fact, the Franks and the Romans. Auvergne was very much influenced by the ancient Roman colonization, and also by the Visigothic domination that had existed in there up to the 6th century. So it wasn't much time before, after all, at this point, and they and especially at this time, this area was influenced by Spain. Spain was one of the most cultivated and civil countries of the time. Was a place where science and philosophy were protected by the Arab rulers, and that were kept very in great with great jealousy. I mean, with great in great importance. They were felt to be, and so these were areas that you knew. Also, this time you have to think of the international situation. Basically, there was this, especially in the West, there was a great balance caused by, in fact, the interaction between the Ottonian Empire and the Caliphate of Cordoba. France was very slowly just emerging as a kingdom. In Italy, there was no major, power. So basically, the world, even in balance dependent on these two powers, there were two centers of culture. Indeed, as we've seen the Ottonians many times in Schwerpunkt, the Ottonians were producing also a lot in terms of imperial ideology, of art. They were recollecting essentially the classical legacy. Also, intellectually speaking, the day before yesterday, I incidentally discussed about this in the literary production of the early Middle Ages. Think about Wipo, these figures that were trying to to structure an imperial ideology through the classical legacy. And Spain also was this amazing center, much more powerful actually than well, okay, they were probably balanced in power at this point. It's not that in this sense the Caliphate of Cordoba and the Ottonian Empire ever clashed directly. They had mostly these proxy wars. There was still the base of Fraxinetum in southern France that was an extremely important center of balance of power because it could access the Rhone and the Rhine Valley with these Saracen raids and so on. It was so Auvergne was pretty close both to these worlds because it was in southern France, and so here between Spain and Germany practically. So they these were areas that received lots of these influences and that were pretty open, pretty predisposed to absorb also these literary models and so on. So Gerbert was uniquely a gifted student. He, in spite of his humble origins, he basically managed to have a pretty speedy ecclesiastical careers. In his youth, he had been living into the Ripoll monastery in Catalonia. So he actually went living in northern Spain, and this was a territory at the border with the Muslim Caliphate. So at this point, it was where essentially all this knowledge, this interaction would pour into also the mindset, the culture, the it was a very stimulating environment. And eventually he passed to Rome, where his fame as master of the arts of the trivium and the quadrivium had produced him lots of followers, essentially, also of high caliber. And you have to think that at this point, especially the political authorities were extremely interested about these young students, because they saw in them a potential minds for essentially producing and backing their own same imperial prerogatives from an ideological point of view, from a propaganda point of view. So it was very important to look at these in the imperial court, in the royal courts. There was definitely a lot of talking about this. Individuals were naturally, when rising through the ecclesiastical ranks, they began also to become more more acceptable socially, covering important ecclesiastical offices and so on. So so he was essentially he was a very accomplished thinker. He was called by the same in 983, if I'm not wrong, was called by the same Emperor Otto II to the monastery of Bobbio into northern Italy. Excuse me. Damn spring. So Bobbio was an extremely important center, extremely important monastery into northern Italy, very ancient post at the crossroads, and it had been founded by Saint Columban, by the Longobard kings. It was one of also the most important cultural centers that had a very important scriptorium, so it had a great prestige, and he had been posing there by the same Otto II as abbot, even though he, the whole community of Bobbio, ecclesiastical community of Bobbio, had opposed this because he was an outside, a complete outsider. And this is actually a good example of what we were talking about before. So these appointments from the imperial authority was interfering heavily into these local affairs that were, traditionally going on their own. So at this point, his accomplishments as a scholar began to be known all over the Christian world, and he was actually also still pretty young. And why all this fame? Well, because he was a complete scholar. He knew a lot of things, especially, and he had acquired, especially during his thanks to his journey into Spain, this interest for science that at the time was definitely exceptional. Very few people studied such subjects. As we've said, the court of Cordoba was this very important scientific center. It was a great philosophical, scientific activity, and this had a fallout on the surrounding countries, also of Christianity. So Gerbert was passionate about mathematics, astronomy, and he was especially a great book hunter. All the great, this is a moment into which very slowly Europe is put in motion, also from terms of book circulations. There's an interest for the monastic libraries begin to grow in size, and to the books within them begin to circulate. This is something that is often overlooked, is that this myth that books in monasteries remained buried and there nobody read them. This is absolutely false. Medieval Europe was extremely dynamic in this sense. the same development of the ecclesiastical hierarchies that we have seen, also because of these strictly political reasons, brought this high clergy to be, first of all, much more educated, but also to travel much more. So even to have the chance to go to visit different places, to have a to physically go into certain libraries, for instance, and to read other books. At this time, as often said, having, I don't know, a library of 70 books was something, wow, my God, 70 books. You basically owned half of the available knowledge that existed at the time. So these were complete scholars that being in fact passing in this also international, after Carolingian times, the range of travel of the clergy had definitely increased. There had the structuring of the ecclesiastical centers and their net of communication had survived successfully the end of the Carolingian Empire, in spite of all the second invasions of all the provinces. So at this point, it was much more frequent for some students to go study somewhere far and to even change place while progressing into the ecclesiastical career. So Gerbert also had a great also practical interest towards, for instance, the study of the stars with new instruments. He was in fact building this vision of culture that was somewhat new at that time. So not just sticking to the book, but also looking at the surrounding world from a scientific point of view. So the Arabs at this time were pioneering in that culture. I made, incidentally, a video just recently that I realize it's exactly about the same times, but the cultural influence of medieval Islam, that makes you understand how really important the fallout of the Islamic studies at this point was being for the revival of the same Christian, the cultural revival of the Christian world. So this was knowledge that was coming also from another world, and Gerbert was. In fact, up to that point, the vision of the world was considered basically only through the reading and the exegesis of the Holy Scriptures, nothing else. So having someone who had this scientific interests was something so even controversial, because people said, why does this guy do that? But as always, this was knowledge that was increasingly appreciated at the time. So he was a path opener in many ways, and he attracted the interest of so many other young students that wanted to know about these new things coming from this exotic world of the East and so on. So there were these characteristics that, in fact, especially in later times, would develop a legion, according to which Gerbert would have been would be a sort of magician, or even someone who was in close to the devil, and so to learn new ways that were aimed at these very mysterious and things like he was accused of wanting eventually to arrive to the papacy because he had gained all these experiences and to find the treasures and the marvels that were buried in the Roman underground, under the Roman in the Roman soil. So it was this controversial figure, as indeed the canons of culture at the time were very, very different from this one. And naturally, as a complete clergyman of the time, Gerbert was very interested in law and politics as well. And we have seen how much the clergymen were involved into secular affairs in their own way. And there was a time, there was a point though, is that coming from humble origins, he basically couldn't hope to receive help from his own house in this sense. So he was a bit different from other clergymen at the time, because he didn't have someone backing him. So that's why he also bet so much on his education, so to distinguish himself for his knowledge, for his advice that he could give as a counselor to the great political figures of the time. And in fact, he had this impressive career that brought him to Rheims and Ravenna, that, as we were saying before, were some of the most important centers of Christian Europe at the time. In the time in which that spent at Rheims, Gerbert was very committed into the life of the bishopric and its contrasts, its political contrasts. If I'm not wrong, he at this point he basically had some, well, this is maybe complicated to explain now, that's so important. It's just say that first he got Archbishop of Rheims, then eventually he was obliged to go away from France because he had opposed the marriage of the Capetian ruler at this point because it was anti-canonic with a, and then that's where we went finally to Germany. We have seen that he had already been favored by Otto II, being appointed abbot in Bobbio. It was also his extremely prestigious center. So at that point, France was the second, step. It was higher. Now, definitely, through his German connection, he enjoyed the great protection, first of all, from the House of Saxony, and Otto III granted him in 998 the Archbishopric of Ravenna, and a year after even the Roman diocese. So he was elected Pope. Ravenna is very important because it was this city that was a seat of an archbishopric. Together with Milan, it had been into Italy the fiercest opponent to the Roman dioceses, because, as we were saying before, the Roman popes objectively were not at this time were not still superior to other bishops. There was certain prestige attached to Rome in itself, symbolically speaking, certain prerogatives and so on. But in terms of strict ecclesiastical hierarchy, there was nothing like that Rome could control what was happening to other archdioceses. And Ravenna, especially being relatively close to Rome, it was in continuous competition with it, and eventually Rome would obviously grow to, especially with the papal lordship, to actually even conquer Ravenna, telling the truth. But it was, at this time, it was not, the papal power didn't go much beyond the region around Rome, so it basically even the control over Ravenna by the hands of the Ottonian emperors was important to favor partly also Rome, and that's why Gerbert was appointed first Archbishop of Ravenna and then elected Roman Pope. So he got the name Sylvester II as a pope, and he was, however, very particular for the Ottonian standards, because up to that point Ottonians had treated their popes essentially as chaplains of their own court. So they were now, naturally, the Ottonians were pushing for this even apparent and exterior superiority of the imperial authority on the ecclesiastical one. They had managed to put the Church of Rome in that position. But Sylvester II was very different from this. First of all, he had a huge commitment internationally speaking. He had this extraordinary intuition of the importance of the Christian societies that were developing east of the German world. He had this enormous influence in the Christianization of the Slavic peoples. He strongly backed the institution of their own national churches. He made possible the foundation of the archbishops of I believe it's pronounced Gdzno in Poland. Just tell me what the Gdzno, I don't know. It's in Poland. He recognized formally Stephen I, for instance, as king of the new Christian nation of Hungary, that at this time was basically, having been defeated by the German arms, was framed now into the orbit of the Western Empire, was converted to Christianism. Eventually the Poles, after half a century, would follow also in this way. So he even entrusted Stephen I of Hungary to organize, with a task to organize the church in his own country. So he really left also a lot of autonomy for this to happen. And this time, the Eastern and Western churches were growing distance, and was also a very strong and increasing competition for controlling the Christianization of the Slavic peoples. So it was important also because of this, because it was really a matter of time, of space that had to be covered. In the year 1001, Otto III and Sylvester II were obliged by a local revolt to abandon Rome, and Sylvester came back to Rome only after the death of Otto III, and by paying a sort of humiliating price because of the to the new masters of the city that now was the family of the Crescenzi. So basically it was a pretty dark thing, because now there were many things also with the Marquis of Tuscany, but let's forget about it. He died, however, after a few years in 1003, and he, in this sense, closing an extraordinary career. It was very meaningful for the history of the church. Why? Because he not only, he gave back to the Roman Church a greater, he was empowering for making his successors on St. Peter's soil something more than what the chaplains, of course, of the Ottonians had been practically. He was an extraordinary figure of clergyman, of politician, and of scientist. The the men of church that came after him during the 11th and 12th century were essentially looking at this man, at his work, at his example, because he had embodied a model that went beyond a merely passive role. He had actually taken the lead also in internationally speaking. He had acquired interest and knowledge in many aspects of the world universe, and he had tried in fact to reconcile this, to reconcile the philosophical and theological knowledge, and to assimilate and coordinate the classical culture in a broad, in a broader Christian conception. So this is something that also predates other efforts in this sense. I mean, to maintain essentially to integrate knowledge was not Christian into the Christian world, in his view of the world and of the universe. And he paradoxically favored this progressive detaching from the politics and the role of the empire as such. Even though he had been close to the Ottonians, he kind of showed that the church had the potential to do something on its own, and to go beyond. And this would have enormous consequences for the future, and as we will see in other videos. But I would say I would stop now, and I would like to comment a little bit on this before finishing the video, because yeah, okay, today's video was fortunately shorter than the usual, and I could have talked more, and you have to forgive me because I was very, very tired today. I couldn't talk very well, or at least I talked perhaps worse than the usual. But this is an important chapter we have to go into. I mean, all the factors that contributed to the Gregorian reforms, originally speaking, genetically speaking, to understand the church as an organism of that developed in very different ways. It was nothing even unitary at the beginning. It was, as we have seen, subjected to these forces, external, internal. It wasn't easy to control it. It wasn't easy to achieve eventually what the Gregorian reforms achieved. It was also a process that didn't have necessarily to happen the way it did. Definitely, there was nothing teleological in the creation of a papal monarchy that could substantially come to control the whole European church. It was a moment, however, of great moral need. I mean, this is something that happened at all levels of society, and it can be sometimes a bit difficult to look at precisely, to really understand, but it there was the need for a change that had to put a new order to the Christian society, and that paradoxically is also what the same Gregorian reforms, I can say, betrayed, but they definitely took a very important stand that was also based on the strictly, on the strengthening of the same power of the church. It wasn't something that occurred just as a pure need of purification of a spiritual. No, it was definitely something darker, something more related to the interest of the same church as a monarchy on its own. And in this sense, it's difficult even to criticize, because at the time everybody really did the same thing. What the church was doing was to give essentially a reorganization of the whole ecclesiastical hierarchy, to create an administration, to create a control, to create, however, most importantly, to achieve this autonomization from the secular powers that up to this point had been able to essentially impose on the Church of Rome its own will, its own interest. And it's interesting because this the result that happened, this is what I want to stress, originated from causes that theoretically were opposed to that, to this autonomization of the Roman Church. They became essentially from the other side, from saying, okay, we have to take a control over this church by letting out the local aristocracies, but this was done by other aristocracies de facto. It was done by an imperial dynasty. It was done by someone who had a very strong interest on its own. And it would be interesting to know indeed what would have happened if the Gregorian reforms had not occurred, if the empire had finally managed to fully control the Roman Church as an ecclesiastical organism. And this could have happened even before the empire, telling the truth. I mean, at least the Carolingian one. I mean, even the Longobards could have achieved this at a point. Now, it's very complicated. But aside from this, okay, stop now because I'm just rambling endlessly now. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.